Well, hi everyone, and greetings from Northern Michigan. This is Dr. Bob. Today we're going to have a look at the origins and the first wave of the Spanish influenza. So let's get right into it. Now, the specific source of the Spanish influenza is not known for certain. There were soldiers that came to the battlefront in World War I from Southeast Asia. They had respiratory issues in 1916 and 1917. That may have been the earliest forms of the Spanish influenza. There was also a British Army field hospital in northern France that reported a very significant number of cases of flu and a number of deaths just prior to the outbreak of the first wave of the Spanish influenza. But the most likely scenario is that it started in Haskell County, Kansas, and the 18 patients and 3 deaths described by Dr. Miner were the first cases of the Spanish influenza. The United States entered World War I in April of 1917, and it started a draft in June of 1917. Young men from all over the country went to approximately 32 different training camps scattered throughout the country, and each of these camps had between 35 and 55,000 young men. One such camp was Camp Funston, which is near modern-day Fort Riley in Kansas. Young men from Haskell County, Kansas were drafted into the Army and reported at the end of February, early March of 1918. On March 4th, a camp cook named Arthur Mitchell reported to sick call with severe symptoms of the flu. Mitchell, as I said, was a cook and had been in contact with hundreds, if not thousands, of men. And within 3 weeks, over 1,100 men at Camp Funston were ill with the flu. The camp was severely overcrowded, and many of the men were living in tents in the open. The camp commander went against regulations and brought those men out of the field into barracks. This severely crowded them, with over 250 men in each building. These crowded, enclosed conditions were ripe for infectious disease of any kind. The Spanish influenza, and measles for that matter, were introduced to this population, and thousands became sick. The regulations regarding housing were in place because traditionally, armies were more susceptible to disease than other armies. Bringing large groups of young men into close proximity, especially when those men came from rural communities and did not have much of a travel history, meant that they did not have the immunity against the diseases that, say, city dwellers would have. As a result, epidemics were a chronic problem in military camps. The Spanish influenza was a particularly bad one. The young men that reported to sick call complained of body aches and shortness of breath and weakness to the point that they would fall to the floor. The illness had an extraordinarily rapid onset. Some men would be well at breakfast and dead by dinner. The disease had a very rapid progression, leading to pneumonia and cyanosis. The men would turn blue. Pulmonary edema would set in, and they would literally drown in their own bodily fluids. Within 2 to 3 weeks, the entire 1,100-bed hospital was full of flu cases, and there were thousands more sick in the barracks. Now, to give you an example, a soldier at Camp Funston reported that in his 12-man room, 7 of the men had the flu. Now, when I went into the Army in 1984, I did my initial basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. I then immediately traveled from Fort Jackson to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas for my AIT, my advanced training. And within the next few months, I was at Fort Gordon, I was at Fort Leonard Wood, I was at Camp Custer, and I was at Fort Lewis, Washington. The point is that the Army moves people around for training. Their training is very compartmentalized. Now, the same thing happened in 1918. And within a few weeks, there were cases of influenza at 24 of the 36 main camps in the United States. Now, this initial wave of flu was not that bad. It was described as a 3-day fever. Of the thousands of men at Camp Funston that were sick, there were only about 50 deaths. The majority of the soldiers recovered. However, from Camp Funston and the other infected camps, they traveled by train through small towns along the way to the major ports like New York City. All along these trips, the trains would stop frequently and the soldiers would get off to get fresh air. This exposed the railroad workers and the townspeople all along the railroad lines. Then the men went on to troop ships where they were crammed in like sardines. Their bunks were stacked 4 to 6 high. for the long trip to Europe. When they landed at Brest, another influenza epidemic broke out. The men were then transferred to the front lines in France, where they lived in close quarters in the mud of the trenches. The 3-day fever ran rampant. As these men were taken prisoner, they transferred this disease to the German army, who in turn transferred it to the German population. As casualties were evacuated to Great Britain, the flu went with them, and it got into the British population as well. In May and June of 1918, the British Grand Fleet reported 10,313 people sick with the flu and 4 deaths. In May of that year, the flu made it to Italy and then on to North Africa. Now, while both the Allies and the Central Powers had restrictions on the press preventing them from reporting any bad news that might interfere with the war effort, neutral Spain had no such restrictions. The influenza was widely reported in Spain and Portugal, especially when the King of Spain developed influenza. And as a result, people began to call this the Spanish flu. Now, the epidemic continued to grow. By June, it reached Asia. By July, it reached Scandinavia and Russia. In India and West Africa, the local epidemic would start in a port city, brought there by sailors, and then it would spread inland. This is very similar to what we're seeing with COVID-19 right now, which seems to be centered around major airline hubs: Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta. Looking at the map of cases here in my state of Michigan, you'll see that they are centered down by Detroit Metro Airport and extend outward from there. Now, by July, they began to get a break. The epidemic seemed to be petering out. The virus was running out of fresh people to infect. The first reports of this Spanish flu came out in the Washington newspapers in August of 1918. Prior to that, it had only been mentioned in internal reports, and those reports only went back to about April. Now, while this was a relatively mild influenza with few fatalities, it did incapacitate sufficient numbers of troops to actually have some impact on combat readiness in the final months of World War I. It also spread throughout the world, with the possible exception of Australia. Now, probably the biggest public health issue that we ran into during this first phase was wartime censorship and the Sedition Act. Public health officials, private physicians, and other agencies were not able to spread the news of the pandemic as they should have because of censorship laws. As a result, the first reports of the influenza pandemic didn't arrive until late summer of 1918, when that first wave was felt to be over. And as a result, widespread news of influenza was not released to the general public until late in the summer of 1918. Now, because both the Allies and the Central Powers heavily censored their press during the war, the only reports of influenza came out of neutral countries such as Spain. This is how the Spanish flu got its name, rather than being called the Kansas flu. Now, as you may recall, the Spanish influenza was the summation of a perfect storm of conditions that led to one of the worst pandemics mankind has experienced since the Black Death of the Middle Ages. We had an avian influenza virus, a swine influenza virus. This resulted in a new strain of H1N1 influenza that was extremely contagious amongst humans. It was a relatively mild 3-day fever with a pretty low mortality rate that was known as La Grippe, or the 3-day fever, amongst the troops going off to World War I. Now, in the late summer of 1918, the worst of it seemed to have been behind us. The papers started talking about it in the past tense. However, as soon as we relaxed our guard, the flu did what the flu does. It mutated. So in our next episode, we'll talk about the second wave of the Spanish influenza, which occurred in the fall of 1918. Until then, this is Dr. Bob, signing out from Northern Michigan. Thank you very much for stopping by, and make sure you hit that like and subscribe on your way out.
Mama, please make them hear me, or I can't teach them anymore. This rabbit hole's too deep for me. soul. Above the science guy. Above the science